Once kept under lock and key, portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible.
Since their discovery in 1947, researchers from around the world have been trying to answer one question. What do the Dead Sea Scrolls actually say? They translated the texts, they studied the handwriting, they compared the language, and they built entire theories about who had written them. But what if they had been looking at the mystery the wrong way all along? What if the real question wasn't what the scrolls said, but what were they actually made of? In 2012, molecular biologist Oded Rechavi decided to finally solve the mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Together with his team, he extracted DNA from the ancient parchment, sequenced it, and compared the genetic markers from different scroll fragments, and what they discovered left them shocked. Because hidden inside those scrolls was the DNA of an animal that should never have been there. Not in Qumran, where the scrolls were found. Not in the Judean desert. Not even close. And that single discovery would force researchers to rewrite one of the greatest archaeological stories ever told. But to understand this all, we need to go back to the place they were first discovered. The discovery. February 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib was herding his goats along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. This was one of the driest places on Earth. The landscape was covered with cliffs, loose rocks, and hundreds of natural caves carved into the hills. As Mohammed guided his herd across the hills that day, he suddenly realized one of his goats was missing. He began searching the rocky slopes, calling out and looking into the caves where the animal might have wandered. Thinking the animal might be hiding inside one of them, Mohammed picked up a stone and threw it into a dark opening. He expected to hear a frightened goat run out. Instead, he heard something shatter. That sound made him stop. Curious, he climbed up the rocky slope and carefully entered the cave. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed several tall clay jars standing against the wall. Some of them were broken. Others were still sealed with bowl-shaped lids. When he opened one of the jars, he found long leather scrolls wrapped carefully in linen cloth. At first, they didn't look important. They were dusty, old, and covered in strange writing that Mohammed couldn't read. To him, they looked like nothing more than old pieces of leather. But Mohammed had no idea that he had just uncovered one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. Over the next 9 years, from 1947 to 1956, archaeologists found 25,000 scroll fragments in the 11 caves of this region. Some contained the oldest known copies of books from the Hebrew Bible, including Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms. Others were community rule books, prayers, commentaries, and strange writings describing the end of the world. Together, these texts were written between 250 BCE and 68 CE. That means many of them were already centuries old by the time Jesus was born. For almost 2,000 years, these scrolls remained hidden inside those dry desert caves. They survived the fall of the Second Temple. They survived the Roman Empire. Decoding the scrolls. After the scrolls were discovered, researchers from the American Schools of Oriental Research and the Jordan Department of Antiquities began a long investigation into the scrolls and their origins. But it wasn't easy. Many of the fragments were no larger than a fingernail. Some contained only a few letters. Yet researchers treated every piece like part of a giant jigsaw puzzle. They compared the handwriting, shape of characters, and even the calendars mentioned in the texts. And after a long, cumbersome process, a picture began to emerge. Many of the scrolls described a religious group that lived by very strict rules. They believed in staying spiritually pure, sharing everything they owned, following a strict daily routine, and obeying their leaders. And perhaps the most shocking part was that they followed a solar calendar instead of the lunar calendar used by the priests in Jerusalem. Then there was the famous War Scroll. It described a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, where God would defeat evil and establish his kingdom. To researchers, it sounded exactly like the beliefs of a small religious group waiting for the end of the age. But this story gets even crazier when you look at the nearby ruins of Qumran. Ancient writers such as the Jewish historian Josephus, the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, and the Roman historian Pliny the Elder had all described a Jewish group called the Essenes. These people lived away from society. They copied sacred writings, lived simple lives, and waited for God's final judgment. And they lived near the Dead Sea. So when you compare the scrolls with the ancient descriptions, everything seems to fit. It looked like the Essenes were the group that wrote the scrolls. For many scholars, the mystery was solved. Except it wasn't. As researchers continued studying the scrolls, strange problems kept appearing. The manuscripts showed surprising differences. Different copies of the same biblical books contained different wording. The book of Jeremiah, for example, existed in two noticeably different forms, with missing passages and chapters arranged in different orders. The handwriting also varied enormously. Even stranger, when scientists began using radiocarbon dating in the early 1990s, several scrolls turned out to be older than the Qumran settlement itself. And that puzzled researchers, because if the Essenes were such a strict religious community, why would they preserve multiple conflicting versions of their own sacred scriptures? Scholars came up with different ideas. Some argued that Qumran wasn't an Essene settlement. They thought it could have been a pottery workshop, a military fort, or even a large estate. Others believed the caves were a Geniza, a place where old and worn-out religious texts were stored instead of being thrown away. The ideas were interesting, but none of them gave a complete picture of what the scrolls meant. And so, for the next 70 years, the scrolls continued to puzzle researchers. The lunch meeting. In 2012, molecular biologist Oded Rechavi was having lunch with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi at Tel Aviv University. The two had first met a few years earlier while sitting next to each other on a bus during an orientation program for new faculty. Since then, they had become colleagues. As they were talking over lunch, the conversation naturally turned to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Mizrahi explained the problem researchers had been struggling with for decades. There were nearly 25,000 fragments scattered across museums and collections. Most of them were tiny. They had no titles, no page numbers, and no reliable way to tell which fragments originally belonged together. Even after decades of work, there was always the chance they were putting the wrong pieces together. Rechavi listened carefully to all this, and then asked one simple question. What are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi replied. Animal skin. Rechavi paused for a moment. Then he said something that would change Dead Sea Scroll research forever. Parchment has DNA. It sounded obvious. Yet in more than 70 years of research, no one had ever thought of studying the DNA inside the parchment itself. Rechavi was an expert in ancient DNA analysis, a technique scientists had already used to trace human migrations and population history going back tens of thousands of years. But suddenly, he realized something. If DNA could reveal the history of ancient people, why couldn't it reveal the history of ancient manuscripts? Soon, Rechavi and Mizrahi decided to put the idea to the test. They were joined by Pnina Shor, founder of the Dead Sea Scrolls Unit at the Israel Antiquities Authority. As the project grew, more experts joined the team, including Professor Matthias Jakobsson from Uppsala University in Sweden and Professor Christopher Mason from Weill Cornell Medicine. Geneticists, biblical scholars, and manuscript conservators all began working together on something that had never been attempted before. The DNA Project. The idea sounded simple. If the scrolls were made from animal skin, then somewhere inside that parchment, traces of DNA might still exist. But there was one huge problem. The Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just ancient documents. They are sacred to millions of people around the world. More importantly, they are completely irreplaceable. Damaging even a single letter wasn't an option. So, before the team could answer their biggest question, they first had to solve another one. How do you read the DNA inside a 2,000-year-old manuscript without damaging the manuscript itself? After months of planning, the researchers came up with a solution. Working with extreme care, conservators wore protective gloves and used a fine scalpel to remove the smallest samples possible. Not from the writing, but from tiny, blank edges where no ink had ever been written. Even then, the hardest part was only just beginning. Because making parchment destroys DNA. The animal skin had been soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried. Then the iron-based ink damaged it even more. After that, the scrolls spent nearly 2,000 years inside desert caves before being handled by hundreds of researchers over the next 70 years. Every person who touched them left behind modern DNA. Separating ancient DNA from modern contamination seemed almost impossible. To avoid that, the team worked inside specialized ancient DNA laboratories that looked more like hospital clean rooms than research labs. Every sample was tested repeatedly and verified by different laboratories. Researchers also confirmed the DNA contained unique damage patterns that only develop over thousands of years and weren't the result of modern contamination. Little by little, they began recovering reliable DNA from dozens of different scroll fragments. And when Oded Rechavi finally looked at the results, he realized they hadn't just answered one of archaeology's biggest questions. They had uncovered something that would completely rewrite the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls: the unusual material. Most of the scrolls were made from sheepskin. That made perfect sense. Across ancient Judea, sheep were commonly raised for parchment. They could survive in the dry, rocky landscape around Qumran with very little water and sparse vegetation, but some of them were made from cowhide. When Noam Mizrahi saw these results, he didn't rush to announce them. Instead, he stared at it for a long time. Because this wasn't just an unusual discovery. Geographically, it was almost impossible. Qumran sits beside the Dead Sea in the Judean desert, one of the hottest and driest places on Earth. Sheep and goats can survive there. They're built for harsh deserts, little water, and tough plants that few other animals can eat. Cows are different. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water every day. It also needs large areas of green pasture to graze. There was simply no way an isolated community living at Qumran could have been raising cattle in that environment, which meant something much bigger. If a scroll had been written on cowhide, it couldn't have been made at Qumran. It must have come from somewhere else. And in that single moment, the assumption that these scrolls had been written by the Essenes began to fall apart. Because what the researchers were seeing simply didn't match the story they had believed for decades. And the surprises didn't end there. The cowhide fragments weren't randomly scattered throughout the collection. They kept appearing with specific texts, specific manuscripts, even specific versions of certain books. That couldn't be a coincidence. And when researchers looked closer, they discovered a connection no one had ever seen before. The strange connection. Remember earlier, we talked about the two different versions of the book of Jeremiah. When researchers tested the DNA from those scrolls, they discovered that the shorter version of Jeremiah had been written on cowhide. Meanwhile, the longer version had been written on sheepskin. This meant the two scrolls had come from different regions, and most likely from two completely different communities living in different parts of ancient Judea. Following this discovery, researchers turned their attention to the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. It was a religious text describing angels worshiping inside the heavenly temple. Copies of this same text had been found not only at Qumran, but also at Masada, the mountain fortress where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 CE. Once again, the DNA told an unexpected story. The different Qumran copies had been written on parchment from entirely different animals. That meant the text hadn't been copied in one isolated community. Instead, it had been copied again and again in different places by different groups of people. Now that the team could determine whether two fragments came from the same animal, they wanted to answer an even bigger question. What if the two animals were related? Because if they were, it could reveal where the parchment had been produced and whether several scrolls had come from the same production center. So the researchers turned to a technique called kinship analysis. And here they found something even more surprising. Some of the animals were closely related. While in some scrolls, they found fragments of DNA that had no genetic relationship at all. They came from different animals, different flocks. The Geniza theory. Long before this DNA project began, some scholars had proposed a different theory. They believed the caves at Qumran had never belonged to just one community. Instead, they may have served as a Geniza, a vast library where sacred scrolls from Jewish communities across ancient Judea were gathered and preserved over many years. For decades, it was only a theory, but now, the DNA evidence was beginning to point in the same direction. According to Jewish tradition, any document containing the name of God could not simply be thrown away. Instead, it had to be stored respectfully in a safe place. Communities across the region created special places for exactly that purpose, and the caves near the Dead Sea may have become one of them. Now think about the geography. Jerusalem is only about 20 miles from Qumran. For people living 2,000 years ago, that was a journey that could easily be made. Then came the Roman siege. Between 68 and 70 CE, Jerusalem was surrounded and eventually destroyed. Families fled, communities scattered, and as they escaped into the Judean wilderness, many may have carried with them the most valuable things they owned: their sacred writings, family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, manuscripts that had been copied and treasured for generations. Those scrolls may have been added to a collection that other Jewish communities had already been building for many years. A shared sacred library belonging to Jewish communities across ancient Israel. And if that was true, what does it mean for the Bible that Jews read today? Have they misunderstood how it was formed all along? What this really means? For centuries, many people assumed there had always been one official version of the Hebrew Scriptures. But the Dead Sea Scrolls told a very different story. Take the book of Jeremiah. Researchers now knew that the shorter version and the longer version didn't simply evolve from one another. They came from different communities. Each community preserved the version it believed was correct, and Jeremiah wasn't the only example. The same pattern appeared in Genesis, in the Psalms, and in several of the prophetic books. That meant there wasn't one universally accepted version of Scripture during this period. There were multiple versions, and each believed it was preserving the authentic tradition. In other words, the Bible wasn't yet a finished collection. The process of deciding which books belonged, which versions would survive, and how they should be arranged was still taking place. For years, historians had suspected the same, but now, for the first time, DNA had provided physical evidence that it was true. The world that Jesus was born into wasn't one where everyone agreed on Scripture. It was a world filled with different Jewish communities spread across the region. Each had its own traditions, its own interpretations, and sometimes its own version of the same biblical book. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't simply the writings of one isolated religious group. In 2020, the team's research was published as the cover story of the scientific journal Cell. It marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in Dead Sea Scroll research. Researchers are now continuing to analyze more fragments, combining DNA with new imaging technologies to uncover details that have remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years. So what do you think? Have we finally decoded the Dead Sea Scrolls? Or are they still hiding even bigger secrets that scientists have yet to uncover? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crazy stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.